Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the modern Microsoft data center and the retirement of Server 2003. My name is Chris Sheridan. I'm a lead solution architect here at New Signature, specializing in sort of data center optimization and the productivity suite. Today we're going to go over what's changing in the Microsoft world and how the retirement of Server 2003 really presents an opportunity for us as organizations to move our data center to that next level, to really take advantage of the technology that's out there and utilize.
You will now be placed into conference. To mute your line, press *6. To unmute, press #6.
Welcome to those who just joined, and really to take our optimization of our data center to that next level. So we really want to focus in on the opportunity that exists, and not so much the pressures we may be feeling to migrate off of Server 2003, but really that opportunity to modernize our data center and make the most out of our 2015. So when we think about data centers and the transformation that's been going on for years, first off, cloud is where everybody sees everything going. I get into a lot of discussions with organizations and companies, and we can argue with the predictors and the forecasters as to timing and whether it's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, but at some point everything is going to migrate towards the cloud, and we're going to centralize these networks more and more, and there'll always be those one-off or niche things that we need to keep local, but more and more we're going to see things consolidate and go to the cloud. And we think about the cloud, and a lot of people, I always get a chuckle when people talk about this new thing called the cloud, or somehow the cloud is new. The cloud is in fact very, very old. For those of us who've been doing this a while, this is the way we did things back in the days, back in the 80s and early 90s, was centralized computing. And we got to that decentralized model because of the networks, because networks weren't good enough to handle it. So we decentralized everything, put servers as close to the users, did single-use servers to minimize downtime and to minimize issues or corruption if we lost a single server because we were so reliant on physical hardware. But we've really seen that transformation happen, starting 10 years ago, 11 years ago with virtualization, and now there's really no company I deal with any longer that isn't virtualized to some degree, if not completely virtualized. And now we're starting to take that to the next level of the cloud and centralization so that we can make this easier to manage for us as an IT organization. So when we think about that data center evolution over the years, co-location back in 89 through 2005, and bringing stuff into co-located racks and our generators, all the way through our modular data centers we've been doing, again, right-sized, quicker to market, things like rack space and things like that, to now this hybrid model that we're really moving into, where we're going to 100% move our data center to the cloud, but we'll keep local copies of things that we need. So when we think about that hybrid cloud, I think that's going to be the ultimate model we're going to land on, where we'll move everything to the cloud, but then we'll keep just what we need to hot local for latency, or those latency sensitive items. So again, last piece on kind of setting the tone on the modern data center. I think the biggest things, when you look back, over the past few years, the buzzwords or the things we were hearing from customers that really drove what we were doing and what we were talking about was, about software management and compute management, getting more than 7% utilization out of my processors and more utilization out of the equipment I have, specializing some of the hardware with our SANs and our different types of storage devices and our archives, and our sort of maximizing our human capital, right? Maximizing our IT staff and doing more with less. Dear Lord, how many times have I heard that, or has anybody on this call heard that phrase over the past 5 or 10 years of doing more with less? Whereas now we're really talking more about self-service and how to enable the users to do more. When we think about the millennials and the next generation, for those of you who have attended my other webinars, you've heard me reference my now 13-year-old son, and him walking into my office a few months ago and saying, hey, Dad, can I get a static IP address for a server, and here are the ports on the firewall I need opened in the house because I'm going to spin up a Minecraft server. Well, he is my son, so he's more exposed to technology than maybe some kids. But I've never taught him about static IP addresses, or hadn't yet. I hadn't taught him about firewall rules and ports on the firewall, but he knew these things. He knew what needed to be opened because he went online and read on how to spin up a Minecraft server. Think about his generation coming into the workforce. Think about his generation and those millennials and the generation behind them. By 2020, 2024, that's the predominant workforce, or employee base in our workforce. So understanding that self-service and how to empower users and enable things for users. And the hardware really is going to become a commodity. Hardware is not going to be something, hardware is going to be bought by a handful of companies, and it's going to be all about network storage, mobility. If you attend any of our sort of modern desktop or productivity webinars that we do from time to time, and if you haven't, look for those coming up over the next few months, we really talk about mobility and how to empower users. And the cloud is just a way to do that. And modernizing our data center reduces some of those risks or exposures we've had in the past to really enabling mobility. Because unless you're a Fortune 50 company with data centers around the globe, most companies don't have the capability of doing the resiliency and complexity that the large providers do, like Microsoft. So when we think about all that and we think about that opportunity, again, cloud technology can be deployed 100% on premises and available through a cloud hybrid scenario. Just because you put your toe in the cloud doesn't mean you have to fully move over 100% today. It also doesn't mean that you're not going to have local copies of that data or local copies or local access to that information for redundancy and or for speed. What it does mean, though, is I'm going to have a backup. I'm going to use the cloud as my second data center. So when I'm often talking to mid-sized companies or on the smaller side of large enterprises who maybe only have one data center or they have a second data center, but it's really not geo-redundant. It's in an office that's 20 miles away. So from a disaster scenario, it has some resiliency, but it doesn't have the geo-redundancy that we're looking for. The cloud is just another data center to you. It's another area for you to stand up without having to pay for all the equipment and pay for all of the environment and the setup. Someone's already done that for you, and you can just subscribe to it. So we really want to transform it, but we want to transform it on your terms. We want to do it in a way that's not going to impact the user. We often talk about cost-benefit analysis, both with desktop and server and all the different infrastructure and architecture we look at. If we think of these servers and the retirement of 2003, companies are still running 2003 because one of two reasons. One, the application they're using requires it, and there's no updated version or no compatible version for a more modern OS. Or the benefit that they see from modernizing their data center or upgrading the operating system does not outweigh the cost and energy to migrate. And this is the flaw with on-premise based applications we've had over the years, especially the ones that work really well. If an application doesn't work well, we're in a hurry to get to the next version so we can get the features and functions we want. But if we take, say, Windows XP or most of the Exchange server line, the reason people are very slow to upgrade is because the perceived benefits of the new version versus with a cost to migrate simply doesn't compute or doesn't calculate out. Some of that, I think, is tied to a lack of knowledge or lack of training or information on the features and functions of the new versions. Most of the time when I do these types of webinars or sessions with individual customers, we find that 80% of the application or new features and functions the company was unaware of. They didn't know it existed. And that helps offset that cost-benefit analysis. On the other end, the company doesn't perceive those new features as a benefit to them, so they hang around on the old version until we hit days like today where the end of life is coming on a particular application, and due to compliance and security reasons, we've got to move off of it. When we move to the cloud, we mitigate some of that problem. Our migration strategies and our migrations to new versions of applications becomes much easier. We reduce the cost and the complexity of our migration because we're in a cloud-based scenario. By reducing the cost and complexity of the migration, the cost-benefit analysis doesn't need to be as great. I don't need to derive as much perceived benefit from the application as I did when it was on-premise and it was going to cost 10 times what it would now to migrate. Things like Office 365, when we look at the productivity suite, I think are great examples of this. And on the server side, when we talk about being that hybrid cloud and that speed and being able to spin up a server, test something, prove it out, make sure it's going to work, and then be ready to go when the time comes, really offset some of that cost of, gee, nobody does an in-place upgrade, though that'll change when we look at some of the other applications moving forward. But when we think about it, most of the time we don't do in-place upgrades, we do side-by-side. Well, now I've got to go buy a whole new set of hardware, or I have to expand my virtualization environment, I have to buy more blades so that I can stand something up side-by-side and do the migration. And gee, there's a lot of infrastructure cost there that I've now got to sink in, versus just doing it in the cloud. And when you're done with the old servers, you turn them off, and now you're no longer paying for them, right? As opposed to investing in more hardware and now being stuck with twice as much hardware that maybe you don't need. So we reduce some of that cost and complexity, particularly around areas like storage and ping power and pipe, I call it. Once we reduce some of those costs, we really see a benefit moving forward. So when we think about that impact of the data center and impact to the user, because that's ultimately the key. When we talk about Exchange upgrades, most of the benefit that is perceived is for either a small subset of the users. We think about e-discovery in Exchange 2013. That's really applicable to HR and legal, maybe finance. But most users in the organization, e-discovery is, I'm certain they're happy that you have it, but it's not really a benefit to them. From an email standpoint, they hit send, receive, and it works. So we think about those perceived user benefits. When we talk about the optimizing the data center, what are the perceived user benefits? What do they get out of it to help offset that cost benefit? Well, the first thing is deployment time and the time to spin things up. So when we talk about reducing deployment time, we talk about reducing that time to market, we can be much more agile in dealing to user requests and user information. We can be much more agile in doing upgrades and getting those features and functions to the user very quickly and not having projects drag out for extended periods of time. Reduce cost. Reduced cost is always great for the organization, and while everyone loves it, reduced costs can also lead to investment in other areas, allowing the organization to reinvest that money they were putting into their server infrastructure into more IT staff for better support, or more IT staff for better service, or investing that money into other areas of the organization. And then the other big thing is that reliability, that always on. Right? And this is a great thing to talk about with organizations who have either experienced an outage or remember an outage at some point in their past. Sometimes I'll walk into organizations and, gee, their Exchange has not had an issue for 4 years, and nobody really remembers the last time email wasn't available. And that's great. That means the IT staff has done a good job. It also means they're extraordinarily lucky. Usually when I'm explaining things to users or I'm trying to convey to people, when we think about a processor, an individual processor that's capable of processing 1 billion computes in a minute, if any one of those processes goes wrong, of the billion, then it's a potential that the computer can crash. When you extrapolate that out across a month, a week, a month, a year, it's a statistical inevitability that a computer is going to crash. Statistical inevitability. I don't care the operating system. I don't care what it's running. It's a statistical inevitability that it will crash. That's why when I walk into organizations and they say our goal is 100% uptime, I immediately start quoting SMART goals and saying, so you've now set a goal that is not attainable. Statistically, it's not attainable. There's no way to maintain 100% uptime on something. But we can get close. We can start pushing those nines further and further out and mitigating that problem. And by doing that, reliability of the cloud and multiple backups of the server available in geo-redundant locations, we mitigate that problem. Now, companies have been trying to do this on premise for years, but there's a cost to it, so there becomes that law of diminishing returns where it goes down. Again, so that perceived uptime, or that ability to have high availability within your organization, I think is a real key of the modernized data center. So why, we started about talking about the opportunity, but ultimately we do have to face the fact that 2003 is end of life. The end date for support is July 14th of this coming year. So what that means is the extended support of this going away means no more patching. You're not going to be SOX compliant. You're not going to be PCI compliant. Any of the security or compliance is, there's been no mainstream support for it for years. And really we're talking about an operating system that was written 11, 12, 13 years ago. When we think about that in the software world, anything older than 3 or 4 years is fairly old. Anything beyond 5 to 10 is ancient. And so we really need to look at these applications and look at how to migrate them. I'll get on a little bit of a soapbox here for a moment too. There was a point in the IT world back, 15 years ago, where OS migrations and upgrades were not perceived as the negative thing that they are today. If you go back to Windows 95 from a desktop perspective, Windows 95 launched, everybody upgraded. No company skipped it, everybody did it. Then Windows 98 and NT come into their own, and everybody upgrades. Nobody skips. 2000 comes out. Everybody upgrades. XP comes out. Everybody upgrades. Nobody skips. In an 8-year span, we migrated our operating system on the user desktop 4 times. So every 2 years, we migrated the OS. And these were not small changes. There was radical feature and functionality difference and UI differences in the operating systems. And we did it. And we did it happily, and we embraced it, and we embraced that change. IT was not perceived as easy. Somewhere, though, post-XP, IT became perceived as easy, or became perceived as something that we couldn't ask people to learn new things. And so we started, for lack of a better term, letting the inmates run the asylum. And being afraid of the end users, and being afraid of the business units, and being afraid to push people to learn new things. And there's the balance there of not being too disruptive to the business, but on the flip side, not limiting features and functionality, and not limiting people to what they, the new innovative features. So trying to maintain that balance, trying to maintain that infrastructure, that balance with the end user, I think, became a big concern. And I think we've swung too far in one direction, right? We absolutely can't go the other way where IT, we're just going to upgrade. The day something new comes out, we're going to roll it out with no thought to end user or training or anything like that. We don't want to go that far. But I think we're too far the other way in that we are intimidated. And that's why stuff like 2003 hangs around as long as it does. So with really very few days remaining, and I know it seems like a lot because it's 6 months, and personally I actually can't wait for July, given that winter is hit here in the Northeast. I'm based out of our Boston office, and really can't wait for July to swing around again for the summer. The fact is, it's going to be here before we know it. And when we think about migrating these servers, the fact is we've known for quite some time, but here we are, where people still need to migrate and people still need to get off of these old servers. So from a project methodology or transition standpoint, we really need to get going in the next few weeks if we're going to do this in a controlled fashion. When XP hit its end of life, we saw many customers who called us up the week before, in this case, on July 1st, we're getting that call saying, oh my God, I've got, X number of XP machines still, and I'm not going to be in compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley, and I've got an audit coming in August or September, and I've got a month to get all of these XP machines out of here, or I'm not going to meet my Sarbanes-Oxley, and I'm going to have a material failure, or I'm going to be out of PCI compliance. So we hit a lot of these panics. we'd rather get ahead of it, hence the webinar today, to really inform people what their options are. So what does the end of support really mean? It means that there is no more critical updates, no updates of any kind, not just critical ones. You know, if they discover something that's in a current version and it applies to previous and they still release it, as of July, no more updates, so no new patches coming. There is no compliance, PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA. 2003 will no longer meet these requirements because of the no updates, because there is no more patches. So no business will be in compliance if it's still running 2003. No safe haven. So again, if something goes wrong, there's no one really to call anymore. Even now, today, it's only the most senior or experienced of engineers who still remembers 03, right? Who still has worked with 03. So many people are learning the new stuff, so it's hard to retain some of that old knowledge, and you spend a lot more time remembering how it was back in the old days, right? You know, the days of DC promo are gone, and you know, if you take the modern 2012 certification exams, you know, DC promo is not the way we promote a server anymore to a domain controller, but in the 03 days it was. So really, the time to act is now and begin your planning. Whether that's with a partner like New Signature, on your own, utilizing different resources on the web, you really need to begin that planning now and jump into it. So how do we do that? So the migration lifecycle approach that exists in modern IT, right? First thing is discover. Do you have a full and complete list of every server, what applications it's running, what services it's running, that are on 03? You need to have that written down, complete list, because whether you're doing it internally or whether you're doing it with an external partner, you know, at New Signature, it's one of the first things we ask for or try and create is what's still out there, what's running on that on those boxes, and how do we get it off. Then once we have that list, we begin assessing and start doing rationalization of all the different services and what can move. Then we create different targeted migration paths depending on what that server is doing. Depending on the feature, functions, and role of that server, we start figuring out, all right, is this easy to move? Oh, this one's running DHCP and DNS services. Well, that's easy to move. That's easy to migrate. This one's a domain controller. That's easy to migrate. This one's running a line of business application that is only certified for 03. That's when we need to start remediating and figuring out what our migration paths is. How are we going to deal with this? Is it going to require you to purchase an upgrade for that application? Is it going to require you to do testing to make sure it'll work on the new versions? Once we have it done and we've got our new environment built and we're ready to migrate those services, then we actually begin the process of transferring all of those applications and services onto the new boxes. So these, you know, it's pretty standard, but I find a lot of organizations at that discover phase that we're talking to now, when they're aware of one application, there's one that's top of mind, super critical. Gee, we've got this one application we know we're all nervous about that we've got to move. But when we start digging in, we find that there's 10 other applications that are out there that, for whatever reason, were not top of mind or not an over concern. You know, do you have a domain controller that is still 03 that we need to retire and get out so that we don't have that security loophole? So when we think of the iterative approach from an agile standpoint, from project management, you know, we really want to see that discover, assess, and target phase really is a 4 to 8 week project typically. Now, smaller organizations, obviously, it's going to be much quicker, and the larger organizations, it'll take about that time. But that's really where we're going to spend our time. When we think about that second layer, the remediate and manage, that's where we can take a very long time depending on the application, and there could be capital expenditure or other expenditures we need to have from a software licensing standpoint in order to remediate. And given that we're still in December and budgets may not have been 100% finalized, or even in early January, we can still go back to finance and say, hey, we've identified this, this is a must-do, we have to add this to the budget. Now's the time to do that. We can still have some wiggle room with our different finance organizations. If your fiscal year is, you know, July to June, then it's a little different, and we're not quite as an optimal time, but still necessary that we identify that, and in either case be able to build the business case to go back and explain why this is absolutely necessary. Those sprints become iterative because we'll determine different levels or different applications. We're not going to migrate, if you have 20 different applications we're going to move, we're not going to migrate all 20 at once, because then we're only spending 1/20th of our time focused on each application. So we really do have to create a priority order and a pecking order for these various servers and functions and services that we need to migrate. So again, creating that list, having that master list in that discover phase, really is going to be the key to setting up the whole project plan for the next 6 months. So when we think particularly about that discover and assess, we have a service offering we'll get into here at New Signature where we will go through and help assess, collect that information, deliver you some analysis. We can work with the Microsoft Teams on this. We can use different tools, and we can figure out what's going on and be able to deliver you a plan for the migration itself. So when we think about some of these tools, the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, as well as some of the tools within Azure, do a great job of analyzing what you have, what's out there, being able to identify it and spit back some reports and do some discovery on your network if you're not fully aware of what's out there. So when we think about the assessment and planning toolkit, again, it will also do cloud-based assessments. It will actually, the updated tool gives us back what our process and compute powers are, so that if we wanted to look at migrating it not just to server on-premise but into a cloud-based application, we could do so. So again, it's going to churn out results for us where we're able to identify what type of memory, what it's running, what services we find, service packs, etc., so we can begin and start planning those migrations. If you've never used the map toolkit before, definitely something we can help you with, but it's a great tool that's out there for you to help at least start gathering some information. If you have other monitoring or management tools you use that spit out great reports, those are also great to use. So again, when we think about that, we're going to go ahead and use the toolkit. Again, it's going to do that initial assessment. It's then going to create a task sequence for each computer, so then we can update and deploy that out. It's going to grab all of that information, dump it into an individual place, and then send back that information to the toolkit. So we want to leave this running for a while because it's going to scan everything on your network. And then once we've got everything done, we can start using some different tools for migration. If you're a VMware shop and you've decided you want to migrate your VMs up to Azure, there are tools, both within the MDT but other tools as well, that will help us migrate your VMs up to Azure, or transition those to Hyper-V to get them up in Azure. Or if you're already a Hyper-V customer, how do we slide things up in Azure quickly? Or onto other hardware if you still wanted to do it on-premise. Again, I really have to be talked into still doing it on-premise, and there are workloads that still require to be there. But the more we can leverage cloud, we can also accelerate the time frame. Because if we get into our assess and planning phases and we discover that we need to order hardware, that's going to add 2 to 4 to 6 weeks into our project plan for the migration. So we really, if you're going to plan to stay on premise still, we really need to get going, or you need to get going very, very quickly, because you're going to need to factor in that almost 2-month window for hardware acquisition. So again, our solution offering here, we can do a solution alignment workshop and planning engagement with your organization. You can use what are called deployment planning services days for those. So if you're an enterprise agreement customer, you can use your deployment planning services days to do a planning engagement at no cost to you, simply using your enterprise agreement benefits. If you don't have DPS days, that's fine. We can still do a planning engagement and just go about traditional methods of payment. There are buckets of funding that are available for 2003 end of life. Not too much. A lot of it's been committed out there, but there is still funding available if you are interested. Definitely reach out to us, because especially if you're moving to Azure, or if you're considering Azure as the landing spot for your server migration, there may be more funding available to you. From that planning engagement, we can then transition into an overall assessment and a compatibility assessment and migrate you there, and then actually generate the assessment report, turn that over to you, and from that point you can take that and do the deployment yourself, or ask us to help you continue on and continue with that planning or that migration. But again, the biggest things I want to emphasize are, if you're not looking at the cloud, or if you haven't fully modernized your data center, this is the opportunity to do so. This is the business justification that you can use to do so. You can also use this as a time to upgrade or replace certain line of business apps or other applications with more modern ones. It's also a time to look at the cloud and use this as your stepping stone for migrating into, Azure services and cloud-based storage services, so that you can really take advantage of that and truly move into where the future of, I think, the modern data center is going. With that, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So you can go ahead and type in your questions into the IM window if you still have any. If not, thank you very much for your time. Short and sweet today. Again, 2003 ends on July 14th. We really have 6 months to get all of this done. And if you have questions or need to deep dive, we're happy to work with you on how you can start migrating some of your services to a more modern data center.
Chris, I think we can hang out for a couple minutes, but I'm going to stop the recording now.